How sweet are thy words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path.
Because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and the flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now this is the word which by the gospel was preached to you.
Welcome to the Biblical Christianity Podcast. We've been noticing over the last several podcasts about godly women that we ought to be emulating. In this episode, we're going to switch gears just a little bit and look at a woman, of very poor character, one who was infamous for evil. Her name, Jezebel. And let's remember, for whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, we might have hope, Romans 15 and verse 4. My name is Tom Moore. I am one of the instructors here at the Texas School of Preaching. With me, as always, my good friends and comrades. We have Terrence Brownlow Dendy, the director of the school. Also, Ronnie Surface is one of our instructors, and we are delighted that you are in our audience this hour. Jezebel was a woman that was given to idolatry, false worship. She was a woman who was involved in manipulation and control in an evil way. She was one who hated true prophets of God and godly authority. She was one who was involved in sexual immorality and seduction. And as you can probably figure, she was also a poor mother. When we think about Jezebel, we think about her characteristics. The first thing that we want to maybe look at in this episode is idolatry and false worship. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 31 through 33, it says, "And it came to pass, as if it were a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which had built in Samaria, and Ahab made Asherah, and Ahab did yet more to provoke Jehovah, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel that before him." Now you have to believe that one of the great downfalls of Ahab was the woman that he married.
There's no doubt about it, Brother Tom. I think the Bible goes out of its way to make that very clear here. We know that whenever we began to look at the monarchical period of Israelite history, that there becomes two kings that become the standard, one for good, one for bad. Obviously, Jeroboam, this first king of the divided kingdom, with him being the king of the northern empire. And every time a king is compared to him, it talks about him being like Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin. On the other side of that, in contradistinction, they were like David, he would say, who followed God with all of his heart, or whatever the case may be. And so those have become the two measuring rods of whether a king of Israel is a good king or not a good king. And so obviously Ahab's father, Omri, falls under the category of Jeroboam, who caused Israel to sin. But then the Bible says that whenever his son Ahab comes along, says that as if it had not been bad enough that this guy walks in the shoes of Jeroboam, who causes Israel to sin, the implication is he complicates that matter by marrying this woman Jezebel, this Sidonian princess of this wicked pagan Gentile nation. And so God is seeming as though in this particular text that he's making a point to help us to understand, the reader, that he compounded being a bad king anyway by marrying a pagan princess.
Yeah.
Well, when you consider Solomon, Solomon had many wives, and those foreign wives turned his heart away from the Lord. I think of the Proverbs, and I'm teaching Proverbs this quarter, so I may throw a few Proverbs out here
Mhm.
in our episode today. But Proverbs 31:10 and the virtuous woman, who can find a virtuous woman? Her price is far above rubies. First of all, Job chapter 28, get into a little bit of Job here.
Go figure.
With regards to wisdom,
Mm.
it said the price of wisdom is far above rubies, and this is the wisdom of God. There's only one other occasion when in inspiration we see anything comparative to wisdom that's far above rubies, and that is a good wife. And this is one in whom, according to Proverbs 31, the husband can safely trust
Yeah.
in this one. You cannot safely trust in a woman like Jezebel. She's going to corrupt the man. She's going to corrupt the family. And Proverbs 12:4, a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. But then the contrast of that, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness to the bone.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, in connection with that, in First Kings chapter 21 and verse 25, it says, "But there was none like unto Ahab, who did sell himself to do that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah." Now notice, whom Jezebel, his wife, stirred up.
Yeah.
And so she stirred, you know, when you start going down the road of false worship, it's going to affect every aspect of your life.
That's exactly right. Something my wife and I have talked about is you see these lineage of the kings. Of course, when you look at the Judah side, they're all from the lineage of David. And of course, there are a multiplicity of dynasties whenever you look at the northern kingdom of Israel. But sometimes you'll have a king that's very wicked. He's got a very good son, for instance, Ahaz and Hezekiah. Then you have a very good father, a very wicked son. And we've always wondered if it's not the case that it's the mother that is the X factor in this situation, man. You got a wicked man like Ahaz that's just as wicked as any king of Judah that you ever read about in all of the Bible, but then he's got Hezekiah for a son. How did that happen? Where did that come from? And so we just have always wondered, we certainly couldn't prove it, but we wondered if it's not that mother being a godly mother that becomes the influence that produces a man like Hezekiah, or vice versa when the father is good and the son becomes wicked. But certainly with Jezebel, there's no question there, because we read about her extensively, and the Bible does say, just like you mentioned, that she becomes a very bad influence on a husband who's already had the tendencies, because of who his father is, to go down that path of being a wicked monarch anyway. You add Jezebel to the equation, she stirs things up. But then not only that, we see their child, which comes into to play a little bit later on, Athaliah. And then, of course, there's this ungodly alliance between their child, Athaliah, and Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram. And the Bible will say, Jehoram's wickedness is to be attributed, a lot of it, to his wife and his in-laws. Bible tells you that. And so this is not nothing that's a secret or that we have to guess about.
Well, whenever you think about just the flip side of that, where we're looking at Jezebel and that effect on the family all the way through, well, look at one who was righteous, a woman who should be highly praised and is in Hebrews chapter 11 for her faith. But in Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, this is concerning Abraham. I know him that he will command his children and his household after him that they shall keep the way of the Lord. He didn't raise Isaac by himself. And when you go to First Peter chapter 3 and verses 1 through 6, you see the commendation of godly women, women of humility, women of grace. And who is the example that they use? Sarah.
Yeah.
And so a woman will have a great impact as a wife, as a mother, as a grandmother, and it will impact from generation to generation.
Yeah.
So we think about Jezebel and Ahab, and you know, if nothing else, we learn you need to be careful who you marry.
Yeah.
And that's is a good example of that. But she brought in idolatry and false worship. He went along with it, just kind of like Solomon did. You know, he was not that way at first, but he married the wrong kind of women that began to filter into his life. But when we read a moment ago, it says, "Whom Jezebel, his wife, stirred him up."
Mhm.
I think we have a good example of that in First Kings chapter 21,
Right.
verses 7 through 10, where, you know, here comes Ahab. He's pouting because he wants his piece of property. But then Jezebel comes onto the scene, and what does she do?
Yeah, she basically facilitates the murder of the man whose property their husband wants. And again, when you look at the influence that a wife has in the life of a husband, that's one of the reasons why we're so emphatic about young Christian men marrying faithful Christian women and faithful Christian women marrying faithful Christian men. I don't ever have any problems with teaching that. I'm never making an apology for teaching that God's desire is for faithful Christians to marry faithful Christians. I believe the Bible teaches that coming and going, man. We look at Genesis. You guys mentioned Abraham and you mentioned Sarah. So we see that, but you look at the next generation, Isaac, and in Genesis chapter 24, Abraham goes to great lengths to make sure that his son Isaac doesn't marry one of the wicked Canaanite women in whose land they dwelt, but he would make his servant swear to him that you will not allow my son to marry one of these women, because obviously Abraham is at the end of his life, go back to my homeland, find a godly woman from our family. And so that is done. That speaks volumes. We look at the passage that you just alluded to, Brother Ronnie, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1 through 6. And again, here's something, just a little bit of deductive reasoning. God says, and likewise, you women also be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they may be without the word, the husband may be without the word won by the conversation or the conduct of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. What does that tell me by way of deductive reasoning? That God is interested in this Christian woman being married to a Christian man. And so you do everything within your power to see this man won to Christ so that he might obey the gospel, become a Christian. Obviously, that's God's desire. When you look at Jezebel, she's got every opportunity as someone who's got a great influence in the life of Ahab to say, well, no, you think about this, that this man's not supposed to sell his inheritance. Once that inheritance is given to them from God, it was to remain in the family, is not to be sold, not to be given away or anything of that nature, just passed down in the same family from generation to generation. But lo and behold, Jezebel can't give that type of advice because she's a pagan.
Yeah.
All right, she doesn't know anything about that. All she knows is that my husband wants somebody else's property, I'm going to facilitate him getting it.
After all, he's a king. He ought to have what he wants, right?
Exactly. That's her attitude. And so if we're familiar with the account, man, she goes through some very wicked channels to cause the murder of Naboth so that her husband can go and help himself to his vineyard.
You think also when you talk about manipulation and deceit, some women will use that emotional, that sexual aspect of their marriage to bring their husbands into, situations and circumstances that they do not need to be. And Paul addresses that somewhat. At least he lays down a principle for it. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting at verse 3, let the husband render to the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise the husband also not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one another. Okay. Don't withhold yourself. There are some women, perhaps even some men who, well, if I don't get what I want, if you don't do this, if we can't go in this direction, they're going to withhold themselves.
Yeah.
Manipulation, that emotional manipulation can be strong.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And you think about how this thing progresses. It all began with a false worship, her paganism, and not knowing the laws of God or refusing to know the laws of God, and now manipulation and control leading to murder. This is what happens when you have evil women as a part of a family.
Yeah, you think about it, how evil is she? How wicked is this? Man, here's a man that refuses. So just kind of give you a quick synopsis of what happens here. The Bible says that Naboth's vineyard was beside the palace of the king, and so he wants it for himself. Again, Naboth, being a good, faithful man of God, says, look, I can't do this. Even if I wanted to sell you this vineyard, I couldn't, because the law of God forbids it. And so he's being faithful to the law of Moses. And whenever Ahab begins to pout and cry like a little baby because the man wants to be faithful to God and won't do what Ahab wants him to do, wifey goes in and sees him pouting and crying and is like, aren't you the king? I'll take care of it. It's kind of her attitude is, look, I'll take care of it. And so she goes, hires some wicked men, some false witnesses, sons of Belial, to stand up and say that this man, we witness him blaspheming God. This is a capital offense under the law of Moses. It's capital offense, should be today too. That's not my call, but under the law of Moses, this is a capital offense. And so, in other words, we got 2 or 3 witnesses say we heard this man blaspheme God. They stone him to death based on the testimony of false witnesses that Jezebel dug up. I'm telling you, man, this thing is wicked, and the way that God responds to her shows you just how God felt about this, because he tells her, man, that you're going to pay for this. Ahab is going to pay for it. He says that, dogs are going to eat your body. And before it's all said and done, it happens a little bit down the road, but exactly what he says is going to happen happens. Ahab dies in the battle against the Syrians, and Jezebel is thrown off a balcony onto the ground, splatters, and dogs come and eat everything except her hands and feet, which I think is very telling too.
Well, and when you talk about how evil it is, how wicked it is, the end of all of this is destruction. And you go to Proverbs 7, with the strange woman. And here you see this simple one, this naive young man has no idea what he's getting himself into. And some older men know what they're getting themselves into. They're just manipulated, the flattery, of the words. But notice the end of this man. He goes after her straightway as an ox goeth to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till a dart strike through his liver, as a bird hasteth to the snare. And notice this, and knoweth not that it's for his life. He doesn't even realize what he's getting himself into, because he's allowed himself to be manipulated, listen to the flattery, and he's just in the darkness and can't see the light.
Yeah.
You think about Jezebel. She knew enough about the law of God to use it to her liking.
It's true. That's a good point.
She may have not have known about the laws of the land with regard to inheritances, but she knew this law.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then that might lead us kind of into our next point, because she hated true prophets. She hated godly authority. You look there in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 4, she was trying to kill the prophets of God.
Yeah.
Instead of adhering to the message of God, let's kill the messenger.
Yeah.
And that's something has gone on forever, something that goes on today. People don't like the message, and so they attack ad hominem the speaker, instead of getting down to the truth of the matter. Jezebel is one who hates the true prophets of God.
That's it. As we've said throughout this series, the Bible provides us positive accounts of action, as Brother Thomas B. Warren used to call them, and negative accounts of action. In other words, things that we ought to emulate and things and people that we ought to steer clear of. And of course, when we look at Jezebel again, she's not someone that we want to emulate, but someone that we want to steer clear of. But I love the point that you make, Brother Tom, is that people find themselves in emulation of Jezebel whenever they want to kill the messenger. What is the proper recourse for someone like a Jezebel or someone like a Ahab, her husband, whenever they're hearing the truth of God's prophets? Well, make the necessary adjustment. Make the necessary adjustment. That's all it is to it. Whenever God sends Elijah to let them know that there's going to be a famine in the land, and I'm going to withhold the rain for 3.5 years. What do we do? Let's just get on our knees in sackcloth and ashes and repent and fast and pray for God's mercy. But no, these people dig in, and they would rather try to kill the messenger. And matter of fact, not even try. They did. Verse number 4 says that Ahab had a servant by the name of Obadiah, who, whenever he comes in contact with Elijah, will let him know that, hey, I'm that one who has hid God's prophets in caves. Whenever Jezebel went on this rampage of murdering all of God's prophets, I'm the one that hid some, so that she couldn't get to all of them. But yeah, she didn't just try; she had killed up a lot of God's prophets.
And you see the influence. You talk about Jezebel hating the prophets, and here you see that influence of a wife or a husband in 1 Kings 22:8. The king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, there is one man. Jehoshaphat has said, seeing all the false prophets, do you not have a man of God here? I see all these false teachers. How about a true man of God?
Yeah.
Well, Ahab says, well, there's one. But what did he say?
I don't
I
like
hate him.
Hate
I hate him. Just like my wife hates him. You know why? Because he won't tickle my ears. He won't tell me what I want to hear. He's not a yes man.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, that influence just went on. And we see, in Numbers chapter 16 and verse 1, Kor, Dathan, and Abiram, and their rebellion against authority. But a woman, especially a woman, a wife, can have that type of an influence over her husband, even as Jezebel did Ahab.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you think about how that spirit of hatred of godly authority can infiltrate a home today. How many times have wives coerced their husband in changing their doctrinal stances or doing things he knows are not right
Mhm.
because the wife is wearing the breeches in the house
Yeah.
and leading the husband astray,
Mm.
just like Jezebel has done here.
And it's not rocket science. We see it from day one. We see it from day one, literally. The Bible tells you in many different places, Paul's writings, especially places like 1 Timothy chapter 2, when he's describing the gender roles in the church, and he gives an explanation as to why he says what he says around verse number 11, where he says, I suffer not a woman to teach nor usurp authority over a man, but to be in silence in the church. He gives an explanation from creation as to why that is the case. All right. But he also talks about the idea of the deception as well. He goes back to the beginning, says, first of all, Eve was created subsequently. Adam was created first, then Eve, but also the man wasn't caught up in the transgression. It was a woman. Well, he mentions the same thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse number 4 and 5, where he's telling the Corinthian congregation that I fear that you, just as Eve was manipulated by Satan, are being corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. And so the Bible mentions it on a couple of different occasions in New Testament commentary that Eve was the one who was manipulated in the transgression. And you go back to Genesis chapter 3 and you read that Satan approaches Eve and says to her, I'm not trying to give Eve a bad rap, I'm just saying, I'm showing you the influence that a wife has in the life of a husband. So Satan goes to Eve and says, yea, as God said, you should not eat of every tree of the garden. Of course, so that conversation ensues between Satan and Eve. She's deceived. She's manipulated. She eats this fruit, but the Bible says she just turned around and gives it to her husband who's right there. What was Adam's issue? I think his issue was trying to please his wife, all right? Because he wasn't deceived. The Bible makes sure that it points that out to you in the New Testament commentary, that he wasn't the one that's deceived. She was. Well, how does he end up partaking of the fruit? Well, this beautiful, influential wife at his side just turns around and gives it to him, and he just takes it and eats it. Man, that's something the Bible seeks to help us to understand and press upon our minds, is that your spouse, and this goes both ways, husbands have influence over their wives as well, you need to be careful who you're going to join yourself to in matrimony, because they will, whether you like it or not, whether you care that this happens or not, they will have influence. As a matter of fact, they will generally be the most influential person in your life.
Well, you have examples in the Old Testament time and time again, the warnings and the commandment not to marry those outside of the people of God. Um, in 1 Corinthians, there are multiple times when Paul is speaking. Now, he's not addressing this is who you marry, but he's talking about the context is in marriage. Sometimes just maybe an incidental comment, but on multiple occasions, in speaking of a wife, he refers to her as a sister or in the Lord, and he is emphasizing that uh, this is the influence that one has over their mate. And you're right. A Christian woman should marry a Christian man because of that influence. I once heard a man make the comment: if you marry a woman of the world, don't be surprised if the day after your honeymoon you wake up to find out that your father-in-law was the devil.
Yeah.
Not talking about the woman's daddy, but just her influence on you is going to be a worldly influence.
Well, that's just the facts of the matter. Whether people want to admit it or not, there's only two possibilities for the existence of human beings. Either you're a child of God or you're a child of Satan. I mean, sometimes we get caught up in the fact, well, this person's a good, moral, upright person. Goodness, moral goodness doesn't equate godliness or being a child of God. That's just the facts of the matter. You're either a child of God or you're a child of Satan. There is no in between. Sometimes you need to read the discourse in John chapter 8 or the dialogue in John chapter 8 between Christ and the Jews. Man, there's no middle ground here. You're either a child of God or a child of Satan.
Well, Look at Jezebel here. So we've got she was involved in idolatry and worship, false worship she brought into the family.
Mm-hmm.
She was manipulative and she controlled her husband to do things that were not right. She hated true prophets and godly authority. Is there any surprise?
Mm.
Should there be any surprise that all of this was also revolving around or led to sexual immorality and seduction? You look at 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 22, it says, "And it came to pass when Jehoram saw Jehu that he said, 'Is it peace, Jehu?' And he answered, 'What peace? So long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many.'"
Mhm.
So we see, I believe with all my heart, if you're going to be involved in all of these other atrocities, what makes you think that sexual immorality might not come into play as well?
There's just no reason to draw that conclusion, and that generally is the case. Whenever you see idolatry, whether you study it from the sacred text or you study it from a secular perspective, something that almost always goes hand in hand with pagan idolatry is sexual immorality. Almost always. You see it as early as Numbers chapter 25 when Balaam is not permitted by God to curse the children of Israel who are on the journey from Egypt to the land of Canaan. He's literally not permitted to do that. That's one place in all the Bible that you see God literally forbidding, just prohibiting a false prophet from speaking of false prophecy because of what's at stake here with the children of Israel. But the Bible indicates to us later on in the book of Numbers, and also is talked about in the book of Revelation, that Balaam finds a way. God's not going to allow me to get this money. He's trying to get this money from the king of Moab. Says, I got some money for you if you would curse these people. Balaam's covetous. He's trying to get that dollar bill. God won't permit him to do that. So he says, hey, I'll find another way to bring them down. Well, what that means ends up being is he entices them to go and to begin to commit idolatry and physical fornication with the women of Moab. And so that was all intertwined into their religious activities, this pagan worship and this sexual immorality. Of course, you look at Corinth, Greece in the New Testament. I just got finished teaching 1st and 2nd Corinthians here at School of Preaching, and we look at the background of Corinth, Greece. One of the things that has to be brought out is the sexual immorality that characterizes that particular city in days of antiquity. The temple of Aphrodite being on one of the hills there, and this being a temple of the goddess of love, of fertility, of lust, of sexuality. And as the history tells it, there's 1,000 temple prostitutes that would service the men who would come to do worship at that particular temple. But that's not isolated cases. This is what generally is occurring.
No, I'm going to the Proverbs again. Proverbs chapter, well, from chapters 1 through 7, just to emphasize. Solomon emphasizes to his son as he's writing these proverbs, writing this to his son,
Mm.
the importance of purity and avoiding that sexual immorality, fornication, adultery. Whenever you look at chapter 2, verses 16, and there's 66 verses in the first 7 chapters. 66 verses are devoted to the warning of the strange woman. You're looking at, whenever you just break it down by way of verses, you're looking at almost 33% of the first 7 chapters of the book of Proverbs is Solomon warning his son. And who would be more of an authority on the influence of, ungodly women?
That's
Well,
right.
in chapter 2, he knows the character and the consequence of the relations with that strange woman. And the strange woman, that Hebrew term could be referred to a foreigner. It can be used in the sense of, a prostitute, but a nutshell is a woman that doesn't belong to me. No
Yeah.
woman is not mine. And chapter 5, he talks about the strange woman in contrast, the foolishness of being with the strange woman in contrast to the purity and the beauty
Okay.
of fidelity. And time after time after time, Solomon emphasizes and warns his son, stay away from the strange woman. It is the wife of thy youth. That's what God
Yes,
desires.
sir.
You
Yes,
think
sir.
about all of this, and one of the things that's really horrible about this whole scenario is what results between a husband and a wife,
Mm.
and you have children come on into play.
That's right.
You know, we have a woman by the name of Athaliah,
Mm-hmm.
which the daughter of Jezebel. I want you to consider what Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 44 says. Behold, every one that useth proverb shall use this proverb against thee, saying,
Mm.
as is the mother, so is her daughter. You know, we have a lot of sayings, apple don't fall far from a tree, chip off the old block. Well,
Mhm.
when a mother is ungodly, it's highly likely that the daughter is going to be ungodly, and we see that very clearly
Mhm.
with Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah.
No, you really do. She's the same as her, maybe even a little bit worse, because here's a woman who literally exterminates all of her own grandchildren, trying to usurp the throne over Israel, Judah in particular, because now their families are combined. Right. So, man, maybe one of these days we'll talk about the folly of Jehoshaphat and how that God in chapter 21 here, Second Chronicles says, I got a problem with you, man. Even though this is a king that is for all practical purposes, a very, very good and godly king. He's the one that calls for a prophet of God whenever Ahab is trying to bring out Jezebel's false prophets to let them know whether or not they should combine their forces, go to war against Syria. That's the type of man Jehoshaphat is. But then lo and behold, what is that whole context about? This man trying to form a political and military alliance with, to use God's own terms, somebody who hates God, right? And so the prophet Jehu would come to Jehoshaphat after the battle against Syria, where Ahab was killed, and says, "Look, God's got a problem with you, and that's that you can't figure out how not to love those who hate the Lord. That's a problem for God. It's a problem for God, man. We need to understand that in the New Testament. But let's get back to where we're trying to be. That there's an alliance formed between Ahab's daughter, Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah, and Jehoshaphat's son, Jehoram. And again, the ungodly influence. She's, like I said, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. This is a woman who kills all of her own posterity, trying to usurp the throne over Israel and over Judah, and is successful in doing so because she only leaves one small baby that the priest was able to hide. He and his wife were able to confiscate one baby of her lineage and hide that baby until he was old enough to come out and to become the true rightful ruler over Judah. And so this is a wicked woman, man, who could do something like that.
I just want to make a comment on this proverb here in Ezekiel, okay, that Ezekiel notes, as is the mother, so is her daughter.
Mm.
Now, I've had occasions to do some counseling with some young folks, pre-marriage counseling. I have 7 children of my own, uh, 3 boys. All of them are married. My oldest daughter is married, and I've told every one of them, told my boys especially, okay, who is this young lady? You want to know what this young lady is going to be as a wife, as a mother? Spend some time in her home and watch her mama. Because that's all she knows. She has been in this home. She was born into this family. She was raised up in this home. If you want to know what your wife's going to be as a wife, as a mother, just observe who would be your mother in law because that's what she knows.
Yeah.
Now, maybe she could come out of that home and be something else. But when you're talking, as we're looking here, as is the mother, so is the daughter. Look to the mother and you'll know how that daughter's going to be.
Just not rocket science, is
No.
it?
It's not. Well, we learned a very valuable lesson, I think, here today is that there are women whom ought to be emulated, and there are women who ought not
Mm.
to be emulated. And Jezebel is so infamous for her wickedness that we don't have time to talk about it, but she's even used as a parallel in the Revelation with regard to wickedness and fornication and all types of evil. And so, one of the things, let me just close with this. I have never known anybody in my life that has ever named their daughter Jezebel just because of the connotation of evil that surrounds her. So, our advice is be a Hannah and not a Jezebel. We're
Mm.
delighted to have you in our audience. We hope the things that we've said have been encouragement to you, that you would strive to be the kind of Christian, the godly man, godly woman that God would have you to be. And that's why we have these examples in the Old Testament to learn from the good, to learn from the bad, and do the right thing. See you next time.